Hi everyone. So I have some comments to make about Michael Cook's book, which will be one of your main sources for your midterm. And Cook covers some of the same territory as Sells, some different territory. Where he covers the same territory, he does it sometimes in a slightly different way to the way that Sells did. And so the idea is that those two discussions, the discussion by Sells, the discussion by Cook, that they complement each other. And hopefully where you have similar material, similar ideas conveyed and discussed in similar but not exactly the same ways, that assists and aids understanding. So that the second take on it, Cook's take, complements and reinforces the first take, that is to say, Michael Sells' take. All right, so I'm just going to hit on a few points as we go through the text here. Mention of George Sale. What's that an example of? 1734. Sells in his book referred to the way in which non-Muslim people have oftentimes received and elaborated the Quran, and this is an influential and good example of that. So just pay attention there to what Michael Cook has to say about George Sale. Michael Cook, by the way, originally, I believe, from the UK, and he was a professor for a long time at Princeton University. All right, so I would draw your attention there to the words identity and continuity. At the bottom of the page there, the Quran has constituted a remarkably strong core of identity and continuity for a religious tradition now in its 15th century. So the idea of the Quran as a core there, I think, is quite helpful. And that is something also that I think the film that we have also in this module, Quran by Heart, also speaks to, where you see the Quran as it functions and is used in remarkably different geographical contexts across the Muslim majority world. All right, so sorry about flashing through so many pages really quickly there. I do want to make a quick comment there about the word fidelity, right, and the idea of oral as opposed to written transmission. In our modern industrialized 21st century world, we tend to regard written transmission as more authoritative than oral transmission. That is to say, if we're looking for something that reports something accurately, or with what's in Cook's wording here, with fidelity, we would tend to see the written version, or the written transmission, is more reliable than an oral or recited version. And what I want to just highlight here is that when we go back to the beginnings of Islam, the attitude there was different. That is to say, that oral transmission was regarded as more authoritative and more reliable than written transmission, provided that the person providing the recitation was a person deemed to be of trustworthy reputation. And the film, again, Quran by Heart, I think in a modern way speaks to the way in which people have the ability to memorize and transmit things orally with great accuracy. Where in the film, for example, you see children as young as 7 years old having memorized the entire Quran. And we've seen already in these videos and in Sel's book the way in which the character of the Quran lends itself to memorization. If you didn't understand my pronunciation there, I said lends, L-E-N-D-S, that the character of the Quran lends to memorization. And it would be some time, it would take decades and decades after the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, who, as I think we all know by now, died in the year 632. Try not to overwhelm you with dates, of course, in this class, but that's one you have to know, right? 632, the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It would be decades and decades following his death before the scholarly or general culture of Islam would be such that authority would be regarded as something preeminently to be found in a book, right? Rather than in a recitation given by a person. All right, and on the next page, this is just a point that I thought was of interest. The comparisons that Cook makes here with Buddhist and Hindu scriptures, and noting that the Vedas, for instance, those are the most sacred scriptures in the religion of Hinduism, that they too are conceived as oral, not written texts, and hence the idea of recitation being important there also. Okay, so again, just continuing with this point, the Quran is as much a written text as the Bible, so clearly it has come to be such, right? But that should not obscure the points that have been made already about orality of the Quran and so on and so forth. Okay, so just important background information about the context from which the Quran emerges, that before the rise of Islam, the Arabs were not completely, but you want to pay attention there to the word largely, at the top of the page there, right? Largely confined to the Arabian Peninsula. And then the importance there of Muhammad having created a state in an otherwise stateless tribal society. And it's very important to keep in mind that that state was created not initially in Mecca, but rather in what became named Medina in the year 622, right? So the significance of that is that without sounding too glib about it, without sounding too casual in our language, we could say that Islam is a religion of power, right? Which is to say that according to the teachings of Islam, Islam truly exists in a circumstance where the people who rule, the people who have authority, the people who have power, the people whose laws are the laws of the land are Muslim people, right? That was the case beginning in the year 622 with the state that Muhammad founded in Yathrib, which, as we all know by now, I think was renamed Medina, which simply means city or the city, which is shorthand for the city of the Prophet. This is why the Islamic calendar begins not in the year 610, when Muhammad had his first experience of revelation, or not in the year 613, when, according to tradition, Muhammad began preaching his message to other people, but rather the year 622, when Muhammad founded a state, right? Because ideally and theoretically speaking, Islam is not only what in modern English is conveyed by the word religion, but rather an entire social, political, legal system, right? Okay. I like the wording that Sells has there, where he says the tradition tells us, and that is quite thoughtful wording there. So when Sells says the tradition tells us, that differs from simply saying that such and such happened. So, for example, the tradition tells us that he himself, Muhammad, did not himself assemble the material into a definitive text. So Michael Sells there, our author, is not saying anything one way or the other about whether what the tradition says is completely, fully accurate, right? He's simply saying this is the information that has been passed down to us. But at the same time, he's not denying that the tradition is accurate. He's neither endorsing nor denying. But this is an important reference to chronology and time frame here, right? So according to the traditional account, or according to following Sells' wording, what the tradition tells us, the Quran was not collected together into a text. And you may recall from a previous video the word for that, which is mushaf, M-U-S-H-A-F, mushaf, until roughly 20 years after the Prophet died, or as indicated, what you see there at the bottom of the page, around the year 650. And that was done under the leadership of one of Muhammad's successors, that is to say, one of the caliphs. That word caliph meaning successor and referring to the people who led the Muslim community after the Prophet Muhammad died in the year 632. Now, getting back to that phrase again, the tradition tells us, or what we can also refer to together with what would be called the traditional chronology or the traditional time frame, I would draw your attention there to the information you have on the module about a copy of the Quran, or Quranic pages found in the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom in England, and how that is considered to be one of the very oldest copies of the Quran in existence anywhere. And I would urge you to look at those videos and to pay particular attention to two things. Number one, what is said about how old that copy is, and number two, what is said about how it aligns with, or how it is similar to the Qurans that other Qurans that have come down to us to the present day. All right, so I've just written here, this is an important vocabulary item. This isn't necessarily going to be something you would choose to mention in your midterm, but it might be. you'll see I've tried to make very, very clear that what makes for success in writing your midterm is to be specific, right? You give specific points and examples. As I also said, you can't cover everything, right? So you have to make choices about which points and examples to mention. So this may be one of them, it may not be one of them, but it is an important vocabulary item and an important thing to know. Again, going back to our text here, Michael Sells is pointing out to us that the Quran was not collected into a single copy, right, during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, according to the tradition, but that is thought to have happened, around about 20 years later, or as he puts it, around about 650, right? And this is what is referred to as the Uthmanic recension, right? The word recension, look it up if you don't know it. It basically means a version of a text, right? And it comes from the name Uthman, the third caliph, the person who was the leader of the Muslim community at that time. And it's called the Uthmanic recension because it was put together during the time of his leadership as a result of what he commanded, according to tradition, and that occurred again around about the year 650, right? So that's a very important vocabulary item for you to know, Uthmanic recension. Okay, what is there in bold font? I have nothing to add really, I don't think, to the text. It repeats some of the points made in our previous book, the book by Sells. I think the way Cook here speaks about thematic unity is helpful, and the way he says that only the very, very short chapters of the Quran, the very, very short chapters have what we would call thematic unity. And I think we're pretty clear by this point in our course that the Quran is not a book of law, right, or a book of theology, or a book of biography, or a book of history. And so what you have there, the contrast with Deuteronomy, is just illustrative of that. All right, important note about the empire of Islam by the early 8th century, right? So in other words, less than 100 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs, who at the time of the birth of Islam were a remote, backward, isolated, largely illiterate people, had an empire, right, that went all the way from present-day Portugal, including also Spain, south of France in the one direction, and as far as present-day Pakistan in the other direction. All right, and this is just a stock image of it, not my image here, right? So you see that, right? So that would indicate what the empire of Islam looked like. That particular image would correspond roughly to around the year 750, but as Cook says in his book, in our textbook here, that it reached as far as Portugal, or what is today Portugal here, and what is today Pakistan here, by the early 8th century. Again, for that kind of thing, the goal of this class would be that you have a rough idea of that sort of time frame, right? So you know, for instance, that you at least know which century that would be picturing for us. And I would also draw your attention here where I think the wording is helpful and actually quite important, where he says what is now Portugal and what is now Pakistan, right? It doesn't really help us understand things, and it doesn't really mean very much to say that in the early 8th century, the Islamic empire stretched all the way to Pakistan, right? That's kind of a meaningless statement. Why is it a meaningless statement? Because the country of Pakistan was created in the year 1947, right? The 20th century, right? So well over 1,000 years later, right? So that's why it's important, I think, to use this language, like the language that Cook uses, what is now Pakistan, right? And what that's just shorthand for saying what on today's map is called Pakistan, right? But that's just to avoid speaking about things in a way that doesn't work. So what I'm suggesting here is that when he says things like what is now Portugal, what is now Pakistan, that this is not splitting hairs, right? That there are actually quite significant reasons for wording it that way. Significant if we want to understand the world, right? Pakistan is a nation state, right? Nation states are a feature of the modern world, but obviously when we're talking about the 8th century, we're not talking about the modern world. All right, I think this is drawing attention to an important point, the way the language of the tribesmen of Arabia became that of a major civilization. And you see with the language there, Eurasian civilization, stressing that it went well into Europe, so that the empire of Islam had stretched into what is today Portugal, what is today Spain, and even what is today the south of France. All right. Now, I want to make a comment here about conversion, right? Conversion. So there are two things that happen. Two things that happen. Keep in mind here, going back to what I just said about the Islamic State founded in Medina in the year 622, and the significance of the Islamic calendar beginning in the year 622 rather than, let's say, 610 or 613. And that is because, according to the traditional understanding, Islam is a complete society, a complete way of life, not only what in 21st century English is called religion. So what Sells notes here is that the people converted to Islam, and in many of the lands conquered by uh, the Arab Muslims, people would adopt Arabic as their language. But what I want to emphasize, I said two things happen, right? The one is the expansion of empire that happens very, very quickly. The other thing is the conversion of the people to the religion of Islam. And what I want to stress there is that one of those two things happened very quickly and the other one happened very slowly, right? So the expansion of empire happened very fast, right? The conversion of the people to Islam would happen very slowly, right? So that would take years and generations and decades and centuries. So that even in countries close to Arabia, relatively close, in other words, countries like Syria, or lands like the lands of Syria, the lands of Egypt, it would take a very long time before the threshold of 50% had been reached. That is to say, it would be some time before the populations of those people would be more than half Muslim, right? So getting back to our image here, that image is a political map, right? Shows you the part of the world that was part of the Muslim empire. But what that does not mean is that all of the people who lived in what we see in green there followed the religion of Islam. Many of them did not. Many of them did not. And down even to the 21st century, to our own day, some of those lands, what is today Syria, what is today Jordan, what is today Egypt, what is today Lebanon, have significant Christian minority populations. And there might have been Christians in Arabia itself for as long as perhaps 200 years after the birth of Islam. All right, just note there what Cook says about further conquest. I will just leave that point to his discussion, but do pay attention to that. All right, so here I think we're getting into a different kind of discussion, but the topic is changing, so I am going to stop this video and I will pick that up on a second video, which I will add soon.